All right. So I guess we have to begin. All right. So just a few quick notes before we begin. This session is being recorded, and of course, like we promised. Sorry, is somebody speaking? Yeah. So like we promised, your certification of participation will be emailed to you just after the session. Please do ensure to fill the certificate attendance form. And if you have any questions during the course of the session, you could drop them in the chat. Facilitator would see it and respond to it. And if you would like to ask the facilitator directly,
It's
then
the head of IT governance, risk and compliance for
in
Premium
the
Trust. We've worked
iPhone.
together for 7 years.
Thank you so much. At this
But me and
juncture,
the big
my honor.
interviews like this.
Oh, sorry. There's,
Now me, they would
Olumide, I think you're muted. Sorry, thank you.
all right. So I think at this juncture, it's my honor to introduce our facilitator for today, Mr. Wayemi Otumara, who is the head of IT governance and strategy at Premium Trust Bank. He's a seasoned expert with experience in IT governance and cybersecurity, risk management, and regulatory compliance, including implementing and leading PCI level controls in high-stake financial environments. Of course, Mr. Waimi has gained, practical knowledge, insights, and hands-on experience, which makes him one of the most experienced professionals to walk us through PCI DSS version 4.0.1 and what Canadian organizations must prepare for ahead of 2026. Thank you so much, Mr. Waimi, for joining us today. You have the floor. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Victor. I'd just like to confirm that you can all hear me. You can just indicate in the chat window. Please confirm that you can hear me loud and clear. I'm sure you can see me because I can see myself.
Yeah. I can hear you.
All right, fantastic. So just as the moderator stated, we will be looking today at demystifying, PCI DSS version 4.0.1. And this is particularly targeted at the Canadian space, specifically what every processor needs to know in 2025, right? PCI DSS is a standard or framework that essentially allows for seamless protection of the data that is transmitted every time you use your cards, be your credit cards, the ATM machines, all of the value chain from when the user initiates a transaction. PCI DSS seeks to protect all of those layers. At this juncture, I would put up my slides and you can equally confirm once you can see it. All right. Just confirm that you can see the slides before I proceed.
Yes, we can.
All right. So today we're looking at demystifying PCI DSS version 4.0.1 and what every Canadian payment processor needs to know in 2025. I would just like to establish some ground rules, before we proceed. As you come on the call or the webinar, I would really appreciate it if you can keep your questions in the chat, within the chat box. And as we proceed towards the end of the webinar, we can take those questions. Feel free to document your questions early enough, and then just drop them. If we have enough time, we'll take some of these questions. All right, so Certified GRC is bringing, this topic today because they have identified the need to intimate the Canadian ecosystem, the financial sector within the Canadian ecosystem on the attributes that make version 4.0.1 of the PCI DSS framework unique. the version isn't just an update, it's a significant evolution of the standard, and the reason why we're discussing this now is because the full transition to version 4.01 includes some new requirements. All right. This has already taken effect. And just as the moderator stated, we need to know what is applicable, as we move into 2026. And so our goal here today is really simple. We're looking to provide a clear roadmap for the Canadian payment processors to successfully navigate this, this transition, if you like. Okay. So why are we talking about PCI DSS? Why are we focused on, PCI DSS? Like I stated in my introduction, every payment you process, it is expected that there is trust. And PCI DSS is that rule book that ensures that trust is maintained. And so for Canadian payment processors, compliance isn't just a checkbox. It's not just a regulatory requirement. It is, a framework that ensures that trust is established very early on as a payment processor or whatever role you play within the payment processing value chain. So it's not just regulatory, it's the foundation of, facilitating or guaranteeing reliability, customer confidence, and as well as business continuity. And so, a breach in Canada has two major impacts. Typically, when breaches happen, first, you have the potential for the loss of ability to process payments, from your card brands, whether it's Master or Visa. And second is serious repercussions, under the Canadian privacy laws, like PIPEDA, right? PIPEDA is similar to what you have in Europe with the GDPR, okay? And so this transition to version 4.01 moves the industry from a minimum requirement mindset, to what I would call a continuous and proactive and risk-based security model. Okay, a continuous, proactive, and risk-based security model. And this proactive stance is essential in today's, threat landscape. Okay. Now, what really is PCI DSS? What is PCI DSS? I saw the introductions and I can see that, some of us are, really just trying to get into the cybersecurity space. PCI DSS essentially is that framework that helps protect, card-related transactions. And of course, PCI DSS borrows from a number of other cybersecurity frameworks. But for the purpose of today's webinar, we'll just keep it focused on what the PCI DSS framework means. And so the PCI DSS standard, so the PCI DSS essentially stands for Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. So it's a data security standard. It is a security standard. And of course, this is recognized globally. These sets of security standards are designed to ensure that all companies are accepting, processing, storing, or transmitting card information maintain a secure environment, right? And so just as I've stated earlier, the standard ensures that all of the processing activities that happen from the moment a customer, initiates a transaction, PCI DSS ensures that all of the value chain from, consummation of transactions, are protected and are secured. And PCI DSS, was developed by the PCI Security Standard Council, right? So this is the governing body that has designed this standard, and it essentially protects card data from theft and misuse. Okay, so the key purpose here is to build trust by protecting payment data end to end. So many times during this webinar, you would hear me refer to, you know, initiation and consummation. So at the point where you initiate a transaction via your card or any of the other channels that use cards, whether it's PayPal, you know, Zelle, and what have you, PCI DSS essentially allows you, to consummate those transactions with trust guaranteed. Okay, so we'll move on to who must comply, who should comply to the PCI DSS standard. And, in my introduction, I mentioned that as long as you play a role, as a payment processor, you are expected to comply with the requirements or the expectation of the PCI DSS standard. And so PCI DSS typically applies to any entity that stores, processes, or transmits card data. All right. Any organization that stores, processes, or transmits card holder data, no matter the size or transaction volume. And of course, this includes merchants, in other words, refers to retailers and those playing within the e-commerce space. So the Amazons of this world, would be regarded as merchants in this instance. Payment processors and gateways, service providers handling card data. So your MasterCard, your Visa, will be service providers in this regard. And so in Canada, this extends to fintechs as well, fintech startups, banks, and any business integrating payment functions. All right. Any business that integrates payment functions must comply with the expectations of PCI DSS. All right. Great. So I would move on to what the core principles of PCI DSS is, what the core principles of PCI DSS are. And so using this infographic, I'll just do my best to explain, what the core principles of PCI DSS standard, mean. And so PCI DSS really is built on 6 main objectives, right? These objectives, I'll take them one after the other. And of course, these objectives guarantee, security across this, value chain that I keep speaking about. And so for the first item, or rather the first principle, it speaks to building and maintaining secure networks and systems. You would agree with me that today technology is heavily built upon, networks and systems, whether it's, your data center infrastructure, which again is also layered upon network, inter-network connectivity. And so one of the core principles of PCI DSS is maintaining a secure network and systems. Systems can encompass, your endpoints, whether they are, your servers, your, card data environment, so I mentioned endpoints. So your endpoints are for organizations that process card data. You would typically have administrators who process or who are carrying out changes, updates, maintenances, within the financial institutions. And so that would typically encompass your network. Secondly, second core principle of PCI DSS is to protect cardholder data, right? Every time you consummate transactions, whether it's at the ATM or you do so via e-commerce websites, you have your card holder data being processed. And so you have what is called your PAN, which is usually the 12 digits or more numbers, that you see on your credit cards, as well as the CVV numbers. Those are your card holder data, your name, the expiry date of the card, the institution, these are all cardholder data. And so PCI DSS seeks to protect that information. And you might ask, how does it protect, this information? Typically, one of the tenets of PCI DSS is, one of the very fundamental tenets of PCI DSS is that you must not expose, cardholder data. You must ensure that you have controls in place to keep your cardholder data maxed. All right. We'll move on to the third principle of PCI DSS, and this is maintaining a vulnerability management program, right? Maintaining a vulnerability management program. What does this mean, right? As a processor within the Canadian space, it is expected that you must have a very strong vulnerability management program. And what does this mean? You must have mechanisms to ensure that you constantly probe your systems for vulnerabilities, whether these are happening via, penetration testing, wherein you get the services of, security firms, cybersecurity firms that come probe your infrastructure, they probe your systems and find vulnerabilities with the sole aim of plugging or fixing those vulnerabilities before they crystallize into full-blown risks, right? And so we must ensure that we maintain a vulnerability management program. Ensuring that you also have good audit programs, is also one way to inculcate, a very good vulnerability management program, because once you find vulnerabilities, it is the expectation that the owners, the individuals who are responsible for those gaps, go on to close those vulnerabilities. And so the audit function typically helps to track those vulnerabilities and validates that those vulnerabilities have indeed been closed. Very quickly, we'll move on to the fourth principle of PCI DSS. We'll have to implement strong access control measures. Implementing strong access control measures. What is access control? Access control in the most simplest form is how you prevent access or how you manage access to information, to data, to resources, to systems, to your information assets, right? So ensuring that you implement strong access control is one of the principles of PCI DSS. And it just means that you have systems that are put in place to ensure that you have to guarantee good gatekeeping mechanisms. And so if I'm not supposed to have access to a particular resource, access control, very good access control practice limits me from having access to those resources. All right. Next, we also need to, as part of the principles of PCI DSS, we should also have monitor and test networks regularly. So just as we spoke about maintaining a vulnerability program, we should also have a very, very solid mechanism for regularly testing and monitoring our network. Okay, how do you go about this? Typically, you should have observability tools, tools that are able to give you insights into the state of your network. Tell you these systems or these observability tools can notify you once once you experience service degradation, whether it's increased latency, whether it's complete network downtime. Because don't forget that for you to render service as a processor, you need to rely on secure networks. And so once those networks are down, the service becomes unavailable. And that quickly trickles down into reputational, and legal issues. So you must ensure that you have a mechanism for regularly monitoring and testing your networks, both for service availability and for security vulnerabilities as well. Okay. The sixth core principle of PCI DSS will be to maintain an information security policy. Maintaining an information security policy. And you might ask, what is an information security policy? Okay, an information security policy is a high level, um, when I say series of documentation that you put together, that essentially guides how information is governed, right? And so an information security policy in its most basic form, it is a commitment to ensuring that your data, your information assets is protected, So an organization takes a stand to say that as an organization, we seek to protect, our customers' confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the integrity of the customer's data, the availability of the customer's data, and the integrity, right? So this is usually where the CIA triad in information security is exemplified. Okay. And of course, these objectives, go on to map into 12 specific measurable requirements, right? But for the purpose of this webinar, we won't be looking at that. Certified GRC can provide further insights into these areas. And so feel free to reach out to Certified GRC, after this webinar, if you choose to, want to know more. But again, this additional measurable requirements that form the heart of the standard are available, for subsequent understanding, but at the heart of the the core principles of PCI DSS, these 6 core principles we have just looked at, essentially forms the heart of PCI DSS. Okay. The 12 core requirements, I'll just breeze through this very quickly. So we have 12 requirements from the backbone of PCI DSS, and they are grouped under 6 key goals, from securing systems to building, a culture of security that lasts, right? So very quickly, the first of the 12 requirements within PCI DSS version 4.01 speaks to install and maintain network security controls. Install and maintain network security controls, right? Okay, so what are network security controls? These are network-related controls that are put in place, whether they are firewall-related, configurations, whether they are port configurations that are put in place to ensure that the integrity of the network on which payment processing is layered upon is secure, right? So install and maintain network security controls. And, there are, several frameworks or several standards that you can adopt, to ensure that you maintain adequate network security controls. Secondly, apply secure configurations to all system components. So similar to your network security controls, the next requirements that's centers around configuration also speaks to ensuring that you have secure configurations for all system components. Okay. So you can ensure that you protect stored account data. That's one way to ensure that you have or guarantee secure configurations to system components. Okay. For the third item, it states that you have to protect stored data. Protect stored data. How do you ensure that stored data is protected? You can implement controls such as encryption. You can implement controls like access control. And so access control will limit access to your stored account data. Encryption will also ensure that when that data is transmitted, it is encrypted while in to be. You protect cardholder data by encryption, right? So there are various encryption standards that you can adopt, to guarantee, encryption of data while in transit. And for number 5, we'll be looking at protecting all systems and network from malicious software. How do you protect all systems and network from malicious software? I usually tell organizations that in order to achieve, the 5th requirement, as an organization, you should establish your software baseline, because your software baseline translates to a minimal set of softwares that are onboarded on your endpoint, right? Right. So you ensure that all systems are protected from malicious software. So by establishing this baseline, it is easy to see when a software or a malware or a malicious software that isn't part of your agreed baseline is introduced into the system. There are also mechanisms for you can also go about deploying endpoint solutions, endpoint security solutions that scan continuously the environment and detect malicious software. So this is one way to protect all systems and network from malicious software. And so the 6th requirement speaks to develop and maintain secure systems and software. So similar to number 5, in the process of creating new services, new product, as you ideate new solutions, as a payment processor or as a player within the payment space, you should develop and adopt secure systems and software. How do you do this? You should have a dedicated method for software development. You should also invest in tools that helps to, I wouldn't want to recommend any tool on this webinar, but there are tools that essentially ensure that as you develop solutions, as your developers are creating software and applications and APIs, and the likes, that they maintain, very, very good global best practices in software development practice, right? This is one way to develop and maintain secure systems and software. You should also ensure that you have a very good patch program, that seeks to update softwares that have been found to have vulnerabilities. All right, this is one way to ensure that you develop and maintain secure system and software. Next, number 7 speaks to restricting access to system components. I did speak about access control earlier. And so point 7 speaks to restricting access to system components and cardholder data by business. Need to know, right? This is what I also like to refer to as, you're giving least privilege, giving just the exact privilege that is required, giving just the right amount of access, right? So let us use a typical example. You have rights, you have features of an application that goes, that allows you to view customer data, that allows you to update customer data. And so as an administrator, yes, you may have access to view and update, not necessarily customers' data. You can have the right to update configurations on the system. For others, like auditors, they may have the right to view. And so if you give access to an auditor to be able to update, configurations, then you are not within the confines of giving least privilege. The auditor should only be able to view, while the administrator should be able to view and update, right? So restricting access to system components and cardholder data by business is key, as a requirement for, PCI DSS version 4.01. So again, access control is key for requirement 7. Controlling what access is given, to to, members of your infrastructure or members of the technology team, as case applies. For point eight speaks to identify users and authenticate systems to authenticate access to system components. What does this mean? You need to have a mechanism for authenticating your users. And so authentication ensures that I am stating and confirming that I am who I say I am. Okay. And so identify and authentication essentially helps me validate that I am who I say I am. If I say I am, Mr. Roger, for instance, there has to be a way for the system to know that it's Mr. Roger who is trying to access resources on the system. And how do you go about this? You can have your unique username and password. You can also have, multi-factor authentication. You can have tokens. You can have, one-time passwords, OTPs, that essentially validates and authenticates that I'm indeed who I say I am, right? So this is another requirement of PCI DSS version 4.0.1. Point 9 speaks to restricting physical access to cardholder data. Restricting physical access to cardholder data. Now, for organizations who have their data centers or their servers, or server farms on-prem, within your server farm, where you have your cardholder data, what point 9 is speaking to is that you should have a physical restricted perimeter, that ensures that unauthorized access to the servers that hold this card holder data is restricted. So if it means installing biometric locks in place, biometric controls in place, motion sensors in place, just to ensure that restriction to cardholder data, physical restriction to cardholder data, I beg your pardon, is guaranteed. These are the controls you have to put in place in order to meet with requirement 9. All right, so we have to have a mechanism for restricting physical access to cardholder data. And so point 10 speaks to log and monitor all access to system components and cardholder data. Log and monitor all access to system components and cardholder data. What does this mean? We should have we should be intentional, right, about monitoring activities that are going on within our cardholder environment. And you might ask why? Why do you need to keep a log of activities going on within our cardholder environment? I talked about PIPEDA the other time, which is the Canadian variant of GDPR. Now, when organizations experience breaches, in their systems, you are expected to report, you're expected to notify, your regulatory authorities, the Canadian regulatory authority, PIPEDA in this case, right? And so one way to ensure that you are being transparent in your reporting is to leverage your logs. You can avail your logs as part of evidence that's law enforcement, as part of law enforcement requirements to showcase activities that have occurred in that environment when a breach has happened. And so this is why it's important that you log and monitor all access to system components. All activities that are consummated within your cardholder data must be logged, and made available, when the need arises. All right. So the 11th requirement, which speaks to testing security of systems and network regularly, is again similar to one of the core principles that we looked at in the previous slide. So we're constantly testing, the security of the systems, as well as the network regularly. And this, of course, is exemplified with your VAPT programs, your vulnerability and penetration testing programs. This, of course, is equally exemplified with your audit programs, right? So the audit team will typically set out, an audit schedule, an audit calendar, if you like, that states the periods where they will come audit, the systems. All right. You should also have observability tools to also carry out tests of the system, and ensure that the system is functioning not just optimally, but that it is secure. All right. The very last requirement, which certainly isn't the least, speaks to support information security with organizational policies and programs. I did speak about this on the previous slide as well. And what this speaks to is establishing your information security policy program. PCI DSS, like I mentioned earlier, draws from the ISO 27001 standard. The ISO 27001 standard speaks to your information security management system. In Canada and the US, you also have NIST. NIST is also a standard that is closely closely related to the ISO 27001 standard. And so by creating an information security program, you not only ensure that your card holder, your PCI DSS framework is maintained, but this also extends to your people, the individuals who maintain your information security, your information security program. I always like to say that you can have the best tools, you can have the best solutions, you can have the best monitoring capabilities, you could have a SOC center, but the weakest link is often the human factor. And so by establishing, an information security program, you also extend security to the individuals, the people, who run and manage, your technology infrastructure, your technology space. And so the 12th requirement here speaks to establishing your information security with organizational policies. Such policies can be your password policies, your cryptographic policies, your acceptable use policies. There are, several of these policies that you can adopt, to strengthen, your respective organizations, as you seek to comply with the requirements of PCI DSS version 4.01. All right. Very quickly, I would move on to understanding the PCI DSS life cycle. Now, the PCI DSS life cycle is a one-time project. And so for organizations that adopt PCI DSS, it is a continuous, improvement process. So it's not a sprint. You don't start and stop. It's a lifelong marathon, if you like. And so you often start with where card data lives. You have to identify where card data lives. And so when you start your PCI DSS journey, organizations like Certified GRS can come in and identify where your card data lives. Once that is done, they move on to apply security controls. Don't forget that we just looked at a number of requirements. We looked at core principles. All of those requirements and core principles is really geared at protecting your environment, right, as you process, card data. The third part of the life cycle speaks to regularly testing and validating. So you must have a mechanism, whether it's via audit, whether it's through your vulnerability programs, vulnerability and penetration testing programs, to regularly test and validate that your controls are still valid. And then finally, you have to fix gaps and then improve, right? Fixing your gaps and improving, is the fourth stage within the PCI DSS lifecycle. And of course, this goes back again to one, where you start again by identifying where card data lives, applying security controls, regularly testing and validating, and then fixing your gaps to drive improvements. Okay. So, we are looking at version 4.0.1 of PCI DSS standard. We had come from version 4.0, and there were some minor changes that were made in version 4.0.1. And so for the purposes of this for this webinar, I'll just be running us through what those key changes are. So we moved from version 3.2.1 now to version 4.0.1. And so version 4.0.1 is a slight update from version 4. And of course, it introduces a more flexible, continuous, and risk-based approach. What that means is that risk is now heavily embedded into this update, right? Organizations need to be able to look at their landscape. They need to be able to assess their risk. They need to be able to determine the best controls to plug or prevent those risks from crystallizing, and then repeating that process again, right? So the key changes include a customized approach. And so organizations can design controls that fit their unique environments, right? So this is a bespoke approach to meeting or tailoring, your compliance to the PCI DSS, standard. And so as an organization, you can say, I will implement ABC controls because this is what is applicable to my own organization. I need not apply, certain controls that are not relevant to me at this point in time. And, because we have various players across the card processing or, card processing value chain, you may be required, by virtue of what your business does, you may not be required to do what, another business is doing. And so you can tailor your approach, how do I say this? You can tailor your, your requirements, to meeting, the expectations of version 4.0 based on what you do as a business. So there's a customized approach for meeting the expectations of version 4.0.1. Next, we'll look at enhanced authentication, right? So we now have stronger multi-factor authentication. That's what MFA stands for. We have stronger multi-factor authentication for all access to card data, right? Next, there is continuous validation, right? Just as we saw in the previous slide, there is ongoing proof of compliance, right? So you show that you have complied today, you don't stop there. You keep improving, you keep validating that your compliance scores are not dropping, and so you keep showing that you have proof of compliance, not just by virtue of an annual report that says that you are compliant as an organization. You also have to show that there is evidence to show that you are constantly showing proof of compliance. And of course, there's the update of testing procedure. So there's an updated testing procedure now, which now has clearer guidelines on verifying compliance, right? So in speaking to these, updates, the focus area we'll be looking at, for the next few slides, we're looking at how to, show, stronger authentication. So multi-factor authentication is now required for all access to card holder data, to card holder data environments. And of course, who are these individuals who now need to show, evidence of continuous or to show evidence of multi-factor authentication, access to card data environments. So internal users now need to show that they have multi-factor authentication in place. Administrators also need to show this, as well as instances where you have to initiate remote controls. So every time an internal user accesses cardholder data, they have to use either your multi-factor authentication mechanisms, OTPs, and the likes, to authenticate themselves before they can access the cardholder data. Same for administrators, same for individuals, connecting via remote connections. And of course, this ensures that even if credentials are compromised, data access is still protected. So multi-factor authentication, cannot be overemphasized, here. We must ensure that we have the mechanism for instituting multi-factor authentication. Okay, so encryption and data protection is what we're looking at next. We must ensure that card data is encrypted when stored and when transmitted. So when data is stored, at rest, it has to be encrypted. When it's being transmitted while in transit, it also has to be encrypted. And what are the key updates in the areas of encryption and data protection? We now have stronger cryptographic algorithms, right? We also have clearer rules for encryption and key management. We are now clearer rules for encryption and key management. TLS 1.2, which is an encryption protocol, or higher, is now required for data in transit. And so a practical example is, imagine you have a system that uses outdated protocols or stores your PAN, which is, your PAN refers to your primary account numbers, in an encrypted format. You will be regarded as being out of compliance in this instance. And so encryption is very, very key, as part of the updates to version 4.0.1. Next, we look at the customized implementation. Recall that I mentioned that this version now ensures or guarantees that you can customize your implementation, your adoption of the PCI DSS standard. And so version 4.0.1 allows customized approaches, and of course, this gives flexibility in how businesses meet security objectives. Instead of the previous, in previous versions of the standard, it was a one size fits all. Whether or not you are a card processor, whether or not you are, a merchant, you were required to, implement all the controls. And so now, instead of a one size fits all checklist, organizations can now document their own security methods. And if they provide, of course, if they provide the same level of protection. So what's the Canadian context here? This, of course, is beneficial to fintechs, and SaaS processors, software as a service processors. Of course, this will drive innovation with unique architectures. All right. I dare say that this approach also ensures that rather than implementing controls or investing in, because by virtue of the previous method for the one size fits approach, you would typically then have to acquire solutions or acquire controls that may not necessarily be needed, but just because you needed to comply with the expectations of the previous versions of PCI DSS, you were then bound, to go ahead and make those acquisitions. But of course, this customized approach ensures that you tailor your implementation based on what you do as a business. Excuse me. Okay. Continuous validation. What does continuous validation speak to? So PCI DSS now emphasizes ongoing security and not once a year reporting, meaning you must have a program that ensures that you are constantly, improving, constantly checking, constantly revalidating, your position or your health status as an organization who is complying to the expectations of PCI DSS. In the past, organizations would, approach the assessor. The assessor would, upon completing his examination, give you a report which essentially states that that organization is compliant to the tenets or the expectations of the standard. All right. And that is done yearly. But what version 4.0 is preaching is that you must emphasize ongoing, you must be able to show that you are, you are going through continuous efforts to show compliance year long and not just at the point where the assessor comes. Okay. And so organizations must continuously monitor, test, and prove compliance. And what this means is that you should have regular internal testing, real-time monitoring. I spoke about observability tools, and incident documentation. So when incidents occur, you must have a mechanism for recording your incidents. These are ways that you can show the assessor that you are continuously improving or continuously monitoring, testing, and improving your compliance to this updated version of the standard. So a key idea here is, to note that compliance is now an everyday practice and not just a project. And so it is typical for organizations to see compliance or adoption of such frameworks as a project. And once it's done, everyone goes back to bed, and so compliance is an everyday practice. That's the expectation of, version 4.0.1. For roles and responsibilities, PCI DSS isn't just for IT. That's a misconception that is often that often reverberates with the business. The business will say, "Oh, this is an IT framework or this is an IT standard. The guys in IT should handle it." But you would agree with me that technology plays a critical role in the success of businesses today. And so executives who are navigating through the Canadian regulatory space must ensure that frameworks such as the PCI DSS version 4.0.1 are not just limited to technology alone. The business needs to take ownership. The business needs to pay attention, right? Because whatever the business goals are, for successful organizations, you have to have a mechanism for cascading your business objectives to technology, right? So for roles and responsibilities here, PCI DSS compliance isn't just for IT. Each function has a role. And so you might ask, what is the employee's function? What's his responsibility or her responsibility? And so employees typically who handle card data must do so responsibly. So administrators, auditors, individuals connecting remotely to access resources must ensure that they're doing so responsibly. For third-party vendors, I mean, they are. I wouldn't want to refer to them as a necessary evil, but you must, to a large extent, rely on third-party service providers. For organizations that outsource a number of their functions, you would typically have to ensure that these third-party vendors also comply and maintain compliance with your data. And so instituting very strong data governance frameworks, you're establishing your information security program can also drive compliance in this regard with your third-party vendors. For IT teams, they must also implement and monitor controls. Recall that I have mentioned severally that the whole idea behind the PCI DSS framework is to protect the value chain from initiating transactions to consummating them. And so the IT team, who is typically responsible for maintaining and implementing, monitoring controls rather, must ensure that they are doing this, every step of the way. All right. They must ensure that they are implementing and monitoring controls. And finally, for the executives, they must ensure governance and funding. And so, like I stated in my opening remark, once I put up this slide, executive, top management, senior management, the board should ensure that as they set out business objectives, right, in protecting the business, it is also expected that they ensure proper oversight, and provide the necessary funding. PCI DSS requires that you invest in securities tools, you invest in solutions, right? Cybersecurity solutions. You invest in your people, right? You must expose your people to cybersecurity trainings. You must expose them to, programs that ensure that they are kept abreast with the latest happenings and updates within the cybersecurity space. And of course, this will in turn ensures that the organization is protected when, and you're made aware of, the updates within the cybersecurity space. Okay, so I would like to emphasize again that PCI DSS isn't just for IT alone. Each function within the business has a role to play. Now, let's look at the Canadian compliance overlap, right? What are the overlaps between PCI DSS, Canadian privacy laws such as PIPEDA, which also demands proof of data protection and breach reporting. Recall that when we talked about logging as one of the core requirements, maintaining a framework for keeping logs. And I mentioned that you are required to report, when breaches happen. The Canadian privacy laws in this regard demands proof of data protection and breach reporting. And so together they form a dual framework for trust. PIPEDA, as you have it, is the privacy law in Canada. And of course, specifies how you use your data, how you use your customers' data. And of course, this gives the governance oversight on how data is used within Canada. PCI DSS, on the other hand, speaks to how you protect, this data. So it's a payment security standard that exemplifies how you protect data. This is the overlap between the privacy law and the standard PCI DSS. And then this is how the overlap between the law and the standard, is established. All right. Next, we look at common pitfalls in PCI DSS compliance. Typical issues that Canadian processors face is assuming that vendors handle compliance for them, right? That is a very, very common misconception. Because you outsource your services to third-party service providers, you often imagine that this third-party service provider is responsible, would take responsibility for compliance. As a processor within the Canadian, financial space, it is the expectation, from PCI DSS perspective, that you take responsibility for the vendors that you outsource your business to. They must comply with your established information security policies. It must be seen that you have made a lot of efforts to ensure that due process is followed in your selection of these vendors, right? Where possible, you should also enforce compliance, state your selection criteria such that it aligns with your organization's cybersecurity expectations. So I'll give you an example. As a card processor, or as a player within the card processing space, you can insist that any vendor who is playing or any vendor you intend to outsource certain functions within your business, you can insist that such vendors also have PCI DSS, certifications, right? You can insist that they have business continuity strategies in place. You can also insist that these strategies are tested and they show evidence that they are equally testing, such capabilities. And that becomes the selection criteria before bringing such vendors on board. You can also, as part of the typical issues Canadian processors face, we also note that there's also the idea of failing to document consent or security changes. Consent is key within the PCI DSS space. I'll try to, wrap up. So another common mistake is treating compliance as an IT project. We discussed that in the previous slide. And how do you fix this? You can make PCI DSS part of everyday business governance. All right, make PCI DSS business governance. All right, so I'll just try to rush through the remaining slides so we can take some questions. Beyond regulation, PCI DSS brings real advantages. It builds customer trust. It reduces the risk of data breaches. It strengthens overall security posture and attracts global partners. Attracts global partners. So preparing for PCI DSS in 2026, some of the things you should consider include reviewing your current controls. Okay. Organizations like Certified GRC can come in and look at your existing controls, and then direct you on what needs to be done to meeting the expectations of PCI DSS 4.0.1. You can also update your vendor agreements. You can apply multi-factor authentication and encryption updates, and as well educate your employees while tracking everything. So logs are your proof. You must ensure that you have mechanisms for logging all of your activities within your card holder holder environments, and data holder environment. Sorry. PCI DSS isn't just about passing a test. It's about protecting people, payments, and trust. Certified GRC helps Canadian businesses simplify this journey with tools that make compliance proof effortless. You can join the wait list. They'll be here to help you if you require the service. And I do recommend that you reach out to them. All right, so thank you. At this point, I would yield the mic back to Victor. We can take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wayne, for that insightful and, of course, very detailed session. All right, so very quickly, if we have questions, can we just drop them in the chat room? This is an opportunity for us to get clarity from an expert who has implemented these controls in real financial environment. So before the questions come in, I have one question for you, Mr. Wayne. So based on your experience with PCI DSS 401, what is the most common mistake organizations in Canada are making right now, and how can they correct it before it graduates into something uncontrollable?
Fantastic question. I would say that some of the biggest mistakes players within the Canadian, financials, sector are making is really expecting that the service providers that they do business with would maintain, compliance on their behalf. I mentioned this during the presentation, and this is a huge problem. It is typical for you to outsource, certain services to your third-party service providers, and then you go to bed. Some of the largest data breaches have actually happened as a result of this particular instance, where businesses outsource their services to third-party service providers, and they do not take the appropriate measures to ensure that these service providers are indeed processing, and managing that data, respectfully. And then when breaches happen, a little, a seemingly little mistake, oversight, such as, we expected that the service provider would protect this data on our behalf, becomes a huge regulatory issue. And of course, this cascades into legal and reputational damage. Some organizations have not been able to recover from such, instances. Another thing I would say is that another thing that I see happen a lot is, waiting until such a time when the regulators or the assessor is coming by before you actually plug the vulnerabilities within, your space. And so vulnerability programs should happen a lot more frequently. What I often find is that vulnerability tests, penetration tests are only happening because an audit is going to happen soon. PCI DSS audit is happening soon. And so I often recommend that you have an established timeline, an established framework for ensuring continuous monitoring of your infrastructure, and so you can say on a quarterly basis, I want to have vulnerability and penetration tests done, And this, of course, ties back to the expectation of continuously validating, continuously maintaining compliance, as expected by the standard. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Waimi. So we have two questions in the chat room. I don't know if you quickly take a look at them or I should read them out.
Okay, please go ahead.
All right, so Shevin says, I didn't get that correctly, but I think Shevin, you can quickly reiterate what you mean while I go to the next question. So next person says, where does a person who is starting a new business and new to tech get started with implementing this technology and payments process system? Does infrastructure need to be purchased?
Okay, that's a great question. I think, I think that question was asked by Jay Clark, right? So, yeah, I mean, for someone who's starting a new business and new to technology, some of the questions I would ask in return is, what sort of business are you looking to start? Are you looking to play within, if you're looking to play within the payment space, then you must first figure out where you want to play. Are you a merchant? Are you a processor? Are you processing payments? And so depending on where you're playing within the payment space, that would essentially define how you go about acquiring the corresponding technologies, that would suit, the area that you intend to play in. And of course, the second part of the question speaks to whether or not you need to purchase the infrastructure, right? So, I mean, today we have software as a service, as an option for, businesses. You can leverage, cloud platforms, to build, solutions. You can also you can chase your infrastructure, right? So if you start out as an SME or as a bank or as a fintech, you can purchase your infrastructure on-prem. You also have the option of using, co-location, service providers, and these are service providers who essentially house your infrastructure for you so that you do not have to deal with the everyday headaches of maintaining, that infrastructure. And so because cloud service providers have become quite ubiquitous, you can also leverage, these cloud service providers, whether it's, AWS, whether it's Microsoft, or Google, right? So you can leverage the services of these, the expertise of these service providers in defining or architecting your infrastructure. Okay.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Wayne. Just before we round off this session, okay, there's another scoping your pizza. Okay, just before we round off this session, I don't know if there's any other question anybody would like to ask very quickly before our facilitator drops off.
Hi, good morning. It's Jay Clark here again. I'm not sure. I want to leave the floor open to anybody else, but I just put a little more in the chat. But if I want to, like, basically, I want to work with really vulnerable populations, maybe older adults, some people with cognitive decline online. They're gonna purchase like online programs and activities, and eventually, I'd like to sell digital and physical products. So, can you speak onto that more specifically, please?
All right. So for I think I see your question for vulnerable population online, right? I would say that you must have mechanisms for creating products that are tailored for this, for individuals within the vulnerable population space. And what do I mean? Your products must take into cognizance their vulnerabilities and ensure that as you build such products, you are able to cater for these vulnerabilities, right? So having mechanisms for authenticating these vulnerable individuals is key. What I would recommend is to have, certified GRC, come in and look through your business case and prefer, the best, approach, for designing or tailoring, your product such that it meets the requirements of these vulnerable um, um, individuals, right? And so because you have products that are going to be purchased online, you do have to ensure that you are creating mechanisms for authenticating, these individuals. You have to have mechanisms to ensure that as their data is transmitted, it is encrypted because they are vulnerable and they are very, very prone to making mistakes. And so creating a product, creating a mechanism that first ensures that that first ensures that these products are tailored to this vulnerable population will be the best way to go, before then cascading all of the things we've discussed here, especially around securing, data, card holder data and the likes. Um, that would be my recommendation, especially as you look to sell digital products as well as physical products.
Excellent insights. Really great for consideration of future. Thank you. I really appreciate this.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Wayne. Sure, we had a very insightful session, and of course, everyone did. Just before we wrap up, I'd love to share a quick update from Certified GRC. Currently, we are working on a solution that can help, simplify your compliance, and a platform that is designed to streamline, policy management, risk assessment, evidence tracking, and framework mapping on frameworks like PCI DSS, SOC 2, and NIST CSF. And of course, the exciting part is that as soon as we launch this product, you'll be the first person to know and have a test run of how the platform works, more like a free demo. So we can't wait to share it with you. Thank you so much for joining this webinar once again. We look forward to hosting you again sometime in January next year. Thank you so much, Mr. Wyman. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you so much.